And now we're going to hear from former Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter about this week's confrontations in the Persian Gulf, with potential for Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State's war of words, to turn into a hot war.
My name's Scott Ritter. I'm a former Marine Corps intelligence officer and a weapons inspector with the United Nations in Iraq. Spent the last couple years doing geopolitical analysis for a variety of clients. First of all, let's just start with the man, Mike Pompeo. He is not a diplomat. He has no experience in diplomacy. He's an American politician, a conservative one at that. That's what the world needs to understand. When they see Mike Pompeo, this is not somebody who's cut his teeth on American foreign policy. This is a man who's cut his teeth on, domestic conservative American politics. And as such, he is completely beholden to the domestic political agenda of the Trump administration. And the reason why I emphasize that is that the foreign policy that's being pursued is not designed to solve global problems, but rather appease a domestic constituency in the lead up to a very contentious election for presidency in 2020. That's the foundation. Pompeo's tour is not intended to succeed. I don't think that there's anybody who has two working brain cells functioning that thinks Europe will back down from its position in support of the Iran nuclear deal, that Russia will suddenly become a fan of economic sanctions, etc. This is designed to create a profile of urgency on the part of the Trump administration, saying that the only way to avoid confrontation with Iran, military confrontation, is to make sanctions work. So they're basically setting up a proposition to fail. We must make sanctions work, knowing that Europe and Russia won't go along with this. Therefore, the only option available is the military option. And this is the game that's being played Pompeo. And the reason why I say it's a game is it's designed for appearances only. This isn't a real policy. I don't believe that Donald Trump is sitting in the Situation Room of the White House right now with his military commanders and national security advisors plotting out a Gulf War or a Desert Storm-like military intervention into the Persian Gulf. I think many conservative pundits have noted that if there's one way to guarantee Donald Trump will lose the presidential election in 2020, it's to go to war with Iran, because that's the exact opposite course that he promised he would be navigating when elected. He promised that he would get us out of Iraq, that he would get us out of Afghanistan, and that he would avoid these costly wars in the Middle East. And yet, we now see Pompeo, we see Bolton, we see others thumping their chests as if we're going to go to war with Iran. It's a very dangerous game, because it's a game of brinksmanship. The whole purpose is to get the Iranians to back down and make a phone call to Trump so he can become the ultimate deal maker, the man who can sit down with Iran and renegotiate a deal. This is the fantasy world that Donald Trump lives in. It's very much divorced from reality, but it's the world that we have to evaluate Mike Pompeo's global tour in.
And as part of his tour, he's talking about Yemen, and he's talking about Hezbollah, all sorts of other organisations, national forces and factional forces being supported by the Iranians.
I think that there's some fact behind it, but it lacks any substance or any relevance or any context. We need to understand that in February of 2003, Iran was a relatively contained country. Our invasion of Iraq in March of 2003 allowed Iran to fill a vacuum created by our actions. Their purpose in filling the vacuum wasn't to destabilize the Middle East, but actually to stabilize the Middle East. It was the United States, through its actions in invading Iraq in 2003, that unleashed forces that led to the Arab Spring, that led to the rise of Islamic fundamentalist, Sunni-based Islamic fundamentalism, et cetera, et cetera. And Iran looked at that and said, this is inherently destabilizing. We must, A, move into Iraq and ensure that Iraq doesn't become a bastion of Islamic fundamentalism aimed at Tehran. So they went into Iraq. They set up a pro-Iranian government in Iraq. And think about it. They did this while we occupied Iraq with 150,000 troops. That's pretty audacious. They said, we're going to continue to back the government of Syria because it's been a close ally to us. It's a secular regime that engenders stability in an otherwise destabilized region. They said that we want to have peace and stability in Afghanistan, and that can best be accomplished by getting American troops out of Afghanistan. They said that we will support the Houthi in Yemen in resisting a Saudi-led invasion of their country. You know, the Houthis didn't invade Saudi Arabia. It was the other way around. Saudi Arabia invaded Yemen, and the Iranians are providing support for that. So, yes, there is truth that Iran is a player in the region, but to call it malign is to be ignorant of the realities of the region. It might be malign insofar as it is in opposition to American policy objectives, but since most American policy objectives in the Middle East are either corrupt or in support of corrupt regimes, one has a hard time articulating that the Iranians are the bad guys here.
Now, the United States is something like 6,000 miles away from the Middle East, Scott. Why this obsession? It doesn't seem to have stopped, really, ever since the end of the Second World War.
Well, there's two factors. First and foremost is oil. This goes back to President Roosevelt's meeting with the Saudi king back in early 1945, where the United States promised we would support the Saudis so long as they guaranteed a free supply of oil, free-flowing oil to feed the Western economy. Ever since then, Saudi Arabia has played a critical role in securing global oil supplies, not only in terms of the amount of oil that they produce, but their ability to surge oil production to make up for shortfalls around the world. This brings stability to the oil market. So, it's been imperative that the United States, supports the Saudi regime. Now, the Saudi regime has had to make a deal with the devil. This deal goes back to the foundation of the Al Saud family as the rulers. They cut a deal with the Wahhabists, basically where they said, we will rule. The oil, we will rule the gold. You will rule the hearts and souls. You will have control of Mecca and Medina. Then later on in the 1970s and 1980s, this became a point of conflict between the Saudi government and the Sunni Wahhabists. And so the Saudi government, responds to this by exporting Wahhabism. So the United States, in supporting Saudi Arabia, has been supporting the export of Wahhabist fundamentalism, has supported the birth of al-Qaeda, and indeed, given what we did in Iraq and Syria, supported the birth and functionality of ISIS. But this is what the United States is about. We do things that are, on the surface, just incomprehensible. Why would we support al-Qaeda, the organization that attacked us on 9/11? Why would we do that? Because of oil. Because of the need to engender stability in the commodity that drives the global economy and drives, American supremacy over the global economy. Two, Israel. Israel plays an oversized role in American foreign policy. It's a small country, geographically insignificant, but because of the politics of the birth of the Israeli nation, the linkage between the American Jewish population and Israel that took place after the Six-Day War, the romanticism that came with the state of Israel, the fact that many American Jews hold dual citizenship, serve in the Israeli military, they consider themselves to be an American-like functioning democracy in the Middle East, they're just like us, etc. We've wedded ourselves to Israel and in Israeli policy. We've given them far too much credibility when it comes to military capability, intelligence capability. There's people that say that we're beholden to Israel, etc. That's just simply not true. I'm not downplaying the capability of Israel, but remember that whatever capabilities they have are built upon two things: American money. We underwrite their economy, we underwrite their military, and American military backup. Israel knows, as they learned in 1973, that if things go south, things go bad, the United States will be there. We will literally strip our coffers bare to reinforce the Israeli military so that they can survive on the battlefield. But we've allowed Israel to dictate our policy objectives. We've allowed Saudi Arabia to dictate. It used to be that they were in inherent contradiction with one another, but now, thanks to the deal of the century and other policy objectives of the Trump administration, it seems as if Israel and Saudi Arabia have come together into a joint policy objective of getting rid of Iran, and the Trump administration is leading that charge.
We've seen apparent attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, and the threat potentially to oil supplies through the Straits of Hormuz. Also, drone attack on the pumping stations for the Aramco pipeline in Saudi Arabia. These sorts of things have been being talked about for decades, Scott, but they're just in the last week or so actually apparently happening. How does that sit with Mike Pompeo's tour and the ramping up of tensions with Iran?
I don't believe that the Iranians are innocent players. I believe that Iran has right on its side in terms of objecting to American muscle flexing in the Persian Gulf, but the notion that they're a bunch of school marms sitting back drinking tea while America does nefarious things is absurd. Iran is a very, very, very capable nation, which has performed extraordinarily well in terms of leveraging its influence over the region and its capabilities. It has tremendous capabilities when it comes to threatening the vital national security interests of other nations in the region. And I think we've seen this play out in a limited scale. I think what we saw with the Houthi drone strike against Saudi oil pumping facilities, keep in mind that the drones that were used are Iranian drones brought to Yemen by Iran, and that the Yemenis are trained by the Iranians. This operation was probably planned by the Iranians, and it's a signal. They did not destroy Saudi oil manufacturing capabilities. They interrupted the ability to flow oil through a pipeline that will be readily repaired. It's not the end of the world, but it's a signal that with 7 drones, we shut you down. Iran has thousands of drones. The distances flown from Yemen to the oil pumping stations are significant distances that could easily be flown out of bases in Iran or Syria or Iraq or other places where the Revolutionary Guard has pre-deployed these drones. And the drones are the least of the Iranian capabilities. They have a significant ballistic missile force that is extraordinarily capable of targeting American naval vessels, sinking American aircraft carriers, destroying American airfields. And those 4 B-52s we just flew into Al Udeid in Qatar, they're dead. The aircraft carrier that we want to sail into the Persian Gulf, it will be sunk. It's just absurd for the United States to think that it can operate independently as it has in the past. Iran has been preparing for 2+ decades to fight a war it doesn't want to fight, but one that it doesn't plan on losing. The same thing with the oil tankers. If you take a look at how they were struck in a way that nobody died, the ships were not destroyed, no oil was spilled. It was a signal. It was a signal that we can hit you anytime, anywhere. Even though Iran is denying this, we would deny the same thing. When the United States put mines in the harbors of Nicaragua by the CIA, we denied it because that's what covert operations are, deniable. There's no doubt in my mind the Iranians were behind the attack on the oil tankers. And it was a signal being sent to everybody, don't push us too far because we will dominate you like you've never been dominated before. No ship is safe. We will sink everything. Nothing will transit through the Strait of Hormuz. This was the signal the Iranians are sending. And this is why this is a dangerous game, because we come back to my belief that Donald Trump doesn't really want a war with Iran. But if you push this situation to the brink, these situations have a way of taking on a life of their own, and we will get a war regardless of whether or not that was our intent or not. And if we get that war, it will be one that we will not win, we being the United States. That doesn't mean that Iran's going to dominate us and march down the streets of New York, but Iran wins simply by surviving. Just like Hezbollah defeated Israel in August of 2006, simply by surviving. They also defeated the Israelis in several tactical engagements. And imagine the humiliation of the United States, Donald Trump's great military, when we lose an aircraft carrier, when we lose naval ships, when thousands of American sailors are dead, when the Marines seek to land in Chabahar or Bandar Abbas and find that we have 5,000 Marines cut off, surrounded with no way to escape and forced to surrender. What is the United States going to do then? And the answer is pretty simple. Tactical nuclear weapons. That's how we get ourselves out of... And now we've just escalated this thing beyond what anybody could ever possibly imagine. This is why this is a very dangerous situation.
The Iran nuclear deal is being slowly torn up. No one's quite entirely sure whether it will survive the next couple of years, but one does wonder whether that might lead to a similar sort of situation that we had with Iraq back in 2003, with accusations of weapons of mass destruction, in this case potentially nuclear weapons in Iran.
Well, we come down to, again, the underlying reality is that Iran never had a nuclear weapons program. Iraq did. I mean, that's the fundamental difference between the two. So in order to breathe life into intent, former intent, with Iraq, even though from a practical standpoint, no one was able to provide evidence to back up the claim made by the Bush administration at the time that Iraq was reconstituting a nuclear weapons capability, one could not simply say there never was an Iraqi nuclear weapons capability, or at least a program designed to give Iraq nuclear weapons. They did have such a program. So it wasn't total fabrication. With Iran, they've never had a nuclear weapons program, and that is demonstrable. That has been proven. That is the heart of the Iran nuclear deal. This was the negotiations undertaken by the IAEA and Iran in the aftermath of the signing of the agreement that led to a Security Council resolution saying that they've resolved all outstanding issues, and that the program, the foundation, the baseline we're working from is one of a peaceful nuclear energy, and that's what Iran is working towards. So they're not operating in violation of the agreement. The only person operating in violation of the agreement is the United States, and to a lesser extent Europe, by failing to step into the breach and allow continued economic intercourse with Iran. The Iranians are very clever here. They played, a lot of people don't give them the respect they need, especially their diplomats. They helped craft an agreement, and they played a trick on the United States. The way the agreement was crafted was, at least from the perspective of the American negotiators, was that we anticipated that Iran would violate the agreement. Therefore, we built in mechanisms that would give the Iranians time to change their ways, to be confronted with the reality of their nonconformity, their noncompliance, and then give them time through intermediaries, various committees, various groups that would be formed to change their way and to rectify the problem. And this was built in through Article 26 and Article 36 of the Iran nuclear agreement. Iran's turned the tables. They've now put the United States on notice that you are in violation of the JCPOA. And as such, Iran has the ability to suspend those portions of the nuclear agreement that are impacted by the noncompliance of the United States. And so when the United States says that Iran can no longer ship heavy water to Oman, and therefore, according to the simplistic formulation of Bolton and Pompeo, that means that Iran would rapidly acquire more than the 300 metric tons of heavy water that they're permitted to store on their soil under the agreement. The only way for Iran to stay in compliance, according to the American formulation, is to stop operations at the Iraq nuclear facility, and then the United States achieves its objectives of retarding the Iranian nuclear program. The same thing. They enrich uranium at Isfahan. They've been selling excessive amounts of uranium to the Russians. The United States has now stopped that. The simplistic American formulation is, now that you can't sell this to the Russians, you can't continue to enrich, or else you will accumulate amounts greater than permitted. But what Iran has said is, no, you're the one in violation. Therefore, we can suspend those portions which are impacted by your violation, which means, according to the rule of law, Iran is fully in its rights to accumulate more heavy water, to accumulate more enriched uranium, because it's not their fault that this situation has occurred. It's solely because of the noncompliance of the United States. Now, in 60 days, Iran will have exhausted its dispute resolution mechanisms, and therefore will have every right, for instance, to start enriching uranium to 20%, to start installing modern centrifuges in facilities. And they will be in the rights with the law, whereas the United States is the one sitting on the outside, breaking the law. The problem with the Iranian position is, even though they're legally correct, It's far too complicated and far too nuanced for the average American, and I would absolutely say the average European, to comprehend. Most people say, wait a minute, Iran's operating in violation because they've accumulated more heavy water.
But I mean, perhaps the US is playing a trick on the Iranians in order to trick them into developing nuclear weapons, and which then gives the US a casus belli and maybe the Israelis to attack.
But even if the Iranians do everything they threaten, they're not producing nuclear weapons. They would be producing 20% enriched uranium that's used in the Tehran research reactor as fuel to produce medical and research isotopes. Totally legitimate, totally legal, totally permitted under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nothing the Iranians are doing is related to a nuclear weapons program. They don't have a nuclear weapons program. So the only person the United States is playing a trick on is itself.
Well, they say that.
Now,
they say they don't have any nuclear weapons, Scott. But we know, you know, and I know that back in the 1990s, in the former Soviet Union, places like Ukraine, etc., there were unpaid Russian soldiers, allegedly anyway. The SS-20 missiles, etc., were for sale on the black market. Isn't it feasible that the Iranians and other states may have just picked up a few former Soviet weapons on the cheap there?
No. I'll just say no. It's not feasible that they did that at all. One, as you said, these are simply allegations. There's been no substance put to that. There's never been any evidence that there were any loose nukes in the Soviet Union.
Well, let me just inform you that the program that went out here in the late 1990s with the journalist Roger Cook, he was offered an SS-20 when he was doing secret filming over in Russia. He started off wanting to see if he could get hold of some weapons in the former Soviet Union. Then they actually offered him weapons-grade plutonium, which he had checked, and it was weapons-grade plutonium. They were prepared to sell him on the black market. And then an SS-20, they lifted up the corner of the tarpaulin and there it was. So there is some evidence, even if it's, those tapes then were wiped and that documentary then disappeared off the face of the earth. Something like 30 million British people saw it.
Who has seen the SS-20, was at the factory where they were produced, was at the operation. You don't sell SS-20s anywhere. It's a gigantic missile. It's huge. It's massive. You don't sell an SS-20. I mean, Cook could have paid him $1 billion, and they would have delivered the SS-20 where? And then how was he going to move it? How was he going to operate it? No, you don't sell ballistic missiles of that magnitude on the black market. It just doesn't happen. If he received weapons-grade plutonium, I would imagine that it was in microgram amount. He didn't receive, enough plutonium to produce a bomb. You can get plutonium in that level from a variety of research institutions, and this was the greatest threat in the former Soviet Union. Wasn't that the actual weapon would be gone, but the loss of control over research institutions and things of that nature.
Well, some alleged, Scott, that many of the military hadn't been paid, and they were quite happy for anyone to come along and offer them dollars or some other form of money.
Yeah, but this was looked at. The KGB director responsible for the safeguarding of nuclear weapons never dissolved. They always retained full command and control capability. I just think that void of any hard evidence to the contrary, I'm comfortable with saying that. A, there wasn't a loose nuke problem in the Soviet Union.
Okay,
B,
but what about Israel? Because they do have nuclear weapons. Do you think that they're safe in Netanyahu's hands?
Well, Israel's nuclear capability is designed as, and this is what the West needs to understand. It's a weapon of Armageddon. The so-called Samson option, which means if we're going down, we're bringing the building down with us. That's Israel's life insurance policy. They're not weapons of first strike. I don't see Israel using a nuclear weapon because the second Israel uses a nuclear weapon, the state of Israel ceases to exist. It may not cease to exist immediately, but once Israel uses a nuke, it will be destroyed in a nuclear holocaust in the future by retaliation by a Muslim nation or a terrorist organization or some group. But Israel has these weapons. I would say that nuclear weapons in the hand of Israel are unsafe regardless of who the prime minister is. It doesn't matter if you have a Netanyahu or a Shimon Peres or a Yitzhak Rabin or whoever the future may be. Israeli nuclear weapons are inherently destabilizing. So even if Israel never uses them, their mere presence is a force of destabilization in the region. And the United States knows this. For the same reason, we would view Iranian acquisition of nuclear weapons as being destabilizing. The same logic applies to Israel. Even more so, given the fact that Israel is a minority in a region populated by a majority that resents, their primacy. So I am a big fan of, A, the United States going public with the fact that Israel's nuclear weapons exist, and B, condemning these weapons, articulating a policy that says that for Israel to join the family of nations in a responsible manner, these weapons must be eliminated.
But surely the United States can never do that, Scott, because if they did, that would mean that the US would have to stop supplying Israel with cash every year.
It's a difficult situation for American politicians. You've hit the nail on the head with AIPAC and others. It is all about the Benjamins. The Israeli lobby has bought out a significant portion of American politicians who formulate and implement policies that are extraordinarily one-sided when it comes to Israel. As I said earlier, we underwrite their economy. We underwrite their military with billions of dollars of aid every year. As an American, I'm a little resentful of that, given the fact that we have homeless in the streets of Albany that could benefit from that we have schools that are crumbling, that we have infrastructure that's crumbling. There's a lot of things we could do with that money to benefit Americans, but yet we give it away to Israel, and Israel gives us nothing in return. Nothing.
Well, it gives you a lot of heartache, that's for sure. Do you think this is the end of the American empire, Scott?
It took the Roman Empire centuries to dissolve. We don't have a competitor out there at this juncture. China is on the rise, but it can't project power in a meaningful fashion globally. Military power, it can do so economically, but until it can back up its economic influence with military power projection, China is on the sidelines. Russia is the opposite. It has a lot of military power, a very limited economy. The danger would be if China and Russia ever came together in a true unified alliance. But, the historical problems between Russia and China are real, and I don't see them being overcome overnight. The United States is its own worst enemy. The fact of the matter is, we could leverage our economic dominance into global supremacy without the need of backing it up with a $760 billion military. The fact that we choose to militarize every problem set, the fact that we choose to be bullies as opposed to be functioning diplomats, effective diplomats, only feeds our ultimate demise. But, this is a slow process. It's not going to happen overnight. But I do think that we are participating in the end of American empire. When historians look back, centuries from now, they will view this time frame as one of American overreach, overextension, and as a result, the beginning of the collapse of American empire. But it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Scott Ritter, thanks very much.
Thank you.
That's the former US Marine Corps Colonel Scott Ritter, who was weapons inspector, WMD man in Iraq. Martin, what do you make of his analysis there?
Well, that's pretty solid stuff. I mean, I've read his stuff on the internet and I've followed his stuff for years. He came to Bristol University many years ago.
Today, we've heard also potentially imminent threat from Iran is gripping Washington. But also, we've got our very own Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, who very, very briefly on Monday put out an announcement, which I was quite surprised to see, which was very negative about Pompeo. And so let's have a little listen to that one now.
We are very worried about the risk of a conflict happening by accident with an escalation that is unintended really on either side, and so we'll be sharing those concerns with my European counterparts, with Mike Pompeo, and I think what we need is a period of calm to make sure that everyone understands what the other side is thinking.
That's the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. Didn't sound quite... We were discussing this last week. He was actually seemed to be more bullish, didn't he?
Yeah, well, I think there's obviously considerable concern in the high levels of British policy making about what's going on.
Donald Trump is saying, I hope not. War with Iran, I hope not.
Yeah, but it's not. He's being pushed into a position that he's going to have to do something by his own deep state, with Bolton and Pompeo in the lead.
And there's all sorts of other things going on as well. I'll put some links up to this on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. Key Saudi paper urges US to attack Iran. US official claims Iranian missiles have been spotted on boats in Iranian waters. And there is a real risk, apparently, of miscalculation in US-Iran tensions. Several experts are saying this. And also 2 strikes would win the war with Iran, US Senator Tom Cotton says. 2 strikes. Is that,
well, we just heard Scott Ritter, who's actually a real military analyst, and it won't be 2 strikes. It'll be, probably, if they go to war with Iran, it'll be defeat for the United States of America.
Do you think that there's any chance that the Israelis will be involved too, if something like this happens?
Well, the Israelis have basically manoeuvred the Americans into doing it because they can't do it on their own. And of course, if the Israelis are involved, the Iranians will retaliate against them as well, and they can expect big casualties.
On the other side of this same story, really, the United States apparently is going to announce something called the Deal of the Century after Ramadan with Netanyahu and the Palestinians, which apparently will be somehow bring peace to the region. Well, that's what everyone is saying.
The Palestinian foreign minister speaking today said, the Europeans have got to get off the fence here. They're basically, the Israelis and the neocons in the US want a war in the Middle East. And I think anybody who votes Conservative, for example, in the European elections that are coming up on Thursday needs to think about, do we want a war in the Middle East? Do we really want to get involved in that?
Finally, no increased Iran threat in Syria or Iraq, a top British officer says, contradicting America's deputy commander of anti-ISIS coalition rebuts White House justification for sending troops. Anyway, time to sign off now for the US-owned Comcast News at 8. Thanks to our guest, Chris Windows, and also thisweek, oneword.org.uk. That's where you'll find the story links and show page. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Have a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend too. Please join us for the Politics Show, 6 o'clock next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
Bringing you national news on the hour, live from the Sky News Centre.